I'd like to start off this morning by reading to you a story, just a short story, but I think it'll set the mood for what we're going to be talking about today. The story goes like this. Li Zhenying fell to the floor convulsing, his frail body coursing with electricity. Prison guards, electric shock batons in hand, stepped back unashamedly as he lost consciousness. Inside Nanyang Prison, located in China's Henan province, 25-year-old Li was beginning the 75th day of his fast from both food and water. Although he was 5 feet 5 inches, he weighed less than 70 pounds and had to be carried to a room where officials had arranged for him and his family to see him. The Public Security Bureau, or PSB, is China's secret police. It was hoping that Li's wife and mother would convince him to renounce his superstitious beliefs and reveal the identities and locations of his unregistered house church contacts. When Li regained consciousness, his head was in his mother's lap. She was sobbing. His young wife and sister peered at him in horror. He was an unsightly pile of skin and bones, covered in crusty blood and filth. His ears were shriveled like raisins, and portions of his scalp were exposed because the prison guards had ripped his hair out. Only a birthmark convinced Li's mother that the man she was holding was her son. Soon they all were crying, and Li broke his fast by sharing communion with his family. And then he cried, "I will see you all in heaven." That was April 7th, 1984. Li believed he would soon die for the Lord in that prison, but God had other plans. He was released 4 years later, but imprisoned and tortured twice more before escaping China in 1997. Today, Li Zhenying, age 49, is known to Christians around the world as Brother Yun, a name Chinese believers gave to him to protect his identity. Thousands have been inspired by his account of supernatural intervention and miraculous survival, which he detailed later in his autobiography. And I'll go ahead and stop the story there. But I started with this story of persecution because I believe that there's coming a time in our own country when persecution is going to be at the forefront of everything that we face. Persecution of the Church of God is not anything new. I mean, it's happened all throughout history. Christians have been tortured and killed for their faith. But what is new is us seeing it happening in our own country. Now, we're not really being imprisoned too much yet, but how many of you know who John MacArthur is? Okay? I guess it was about 4 years now, 4 years ago, back when COVID-19 had hit and the government mandated that everything, to include churches, be shut down. And, you know, if it would have been just for the original 2 weeks, okay. But then the government began extending the mandates and, you know, began thinking of just any excuse under the sun to keep the churches closed. But people could still go to sporting events. You know, they could go to any other public event, but somehow at church, COVID spread more. And with John MacArthur, he actually was arrested because he was holding services as he would normally, because there's a biblical command that we don't forsake the assembling of ourselves together. And he was told, hey, if you keep running church services like you would normally, you're going to be arrested. He was told that. And he decided to do the right thing and hold church services anyway. This was in our own country. And he was arrested for doing so. And he was brought to court, and he eventually won, but not before having to face countless court battles and actually being arrested. And there were several pastors in Canada that were also arrested for the same thing. Where am I going with this? We're not yet being tortured and killed for our faith, but I fear that that time is coming in our country. I read to you the example of a man who was faced with an impossible situation. Either disobey God and give up the names of your Christian friends, or be tortured and killed to the point of death. That time, I believe, is coming in America, and it's going to be up to you and me. We're going to be on the front lines of battle, and we're going to be faced with a similar situation. And now I'd like to look at the example of Daniel, who was also faced with a seemingly impossible situation. And we're going to look at what he did. And I want us to see 5 aspects of what remaining faithful to God looks like, even in the face of immense persecution. My first point is God exalts believers because of their faith. Look at Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 through 3. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom. By the way, I'm reading from the Old King James Version. And over these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was first, that the princes might give accounts unto them, and the king should have no damage. Then this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm. So here's Daniel. He was highly esteemed because he was found to be faithful. He was a Jew that was in exile, and even among the Medo-Persian government, he was known as a man who was faithful to his God. And because he was faithful to his God, what fell secondary to that is he was faithful to King Darius. He was a man of truth. And because he was faithful to King Darius, he could be trusted above the other 2 presidents. And so this allowed Darius and Daniel to have a trustworthy relationship, a trustworthy friendship, if you will. And so Daniel, because of his faith, he was esteemed a faithful man, and he was trusted by the king. That's a position really of authority. He was one of the king's chief advisors, if you will. God exalts believers because of their faith. Now, I'm not saying that, if we're faithful to God, we're going to eventually one day become president of the United States. No, but what I am saying is that God rewards those who are faithful to him. And sometimes that reward can be physical, but it is always going to be spiritual. God does always reward those who are faithful to him. He exalts us because of our faith. And even if it's not in this life, that ultimate exaltation is going to be found when we're living with God for all of eternity. God exalts believers because of their faith. In the example of Daniel, it meant that he was given a position of authority. But with great faithfulness comes opposition. Not only does God exalt believers, that's my first point, but secondly, believers will face opposition because of their faith. Now, we've already understood or explained how Daniel had a trusted relationship with the king. But this caused the other 2 presidents and the other rulers of the country to be jealous of Daniel. Verse 4, Then the presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom. But they could find none occasion nor fault, for as much as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him. So they tried to find an occasion against this Daniel. They looked at him, they saw his relationship with the king, and they were jealous of it. Instead of saying, hey, we need to be more faithful like Daniel, no, they decided they were going to be jealous. And they said, let's try to find some way that we can get Darius to not like Daniel. But they couldn't do it. They tried to find a legal way to show that Daniel wasn't being faithful to the kingdom, and they couldn't find one. So they said, verse 5, Then said these men, We shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. See, they understood that Daniel was a very faithful man to his God. And so these presidents and princes, they thought, if there's one way we can get Darius to not like Daniel, we're going to have to convince him to make Daniel's religion illegal. We're going to have to convince Darius to somehow make it illegal for Daniel to worship his God. And then so they came up with this scheme. They devised a plan. Let's keep reading. Verse 6. Then these presidents and princes assembled together to the king and said thus unto him, King Darius, live forever. All the presidents. That's an interesting statement because if you remember, there's only 3 presidents. And they said, all the presidents here. Well, they're obviously not talking about Daniel, so there's only two other presidents that they can be talking about. I just find that interesting. But all the presidents of the kingdom, the governors and the princes, the counselors and the captains, have consulted together to establish a royal statute, to make a firm decree that whoever or whosoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, save of thee, O king, he shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, king, establish the decree and sign the writing, that it be not changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which altereth not. Wherefore King Darius signed the writing and the decree. Now you might be thinking, now Darius, hold up a minute. What are you thinking? Of course, we know the end of the story. We know that the presidents were really trying to target Daniel. But at this point in the story, Darius doesn't even know Daniel is even a part of this. He's thinking of this from a political point of view. In ancient times, it was not uncommon for a king to be considered a god. Okay? And Darius had recently taken command of the kingdom, just in some previous chapters. So he hadn't really been, ruling for that long. And so he was thinking, okay, the people consider me a god. It would not be uncommon for him to declare himself a god. And so, if you sign this writing into law that says for 30 days, no one in the kingdom is going to worship or pray to anybody but the king, that was actually pretty common. And commentators argue that the length of that 30 days is significant because it was long enough to prove that everyone in the kingdom could be loyal to Darius, but short enough that it would not otherwise offend their other religious responsibilities. So there were a lot of other religions in the kingdom, but that 30-day period would be short enough that they could only pray to Darius and yet not offend their other gods. That was kind of the context of this. So here's Darius thinking, this is a great way to test the people that I've just taken rule of, taken command of. He was not thinking at all that this had anything to do with Daniel. But we know from the context that the presidents are jealous of Daniel, and they're trying to do this to get Darius to not like him. So this is all because this is all part of the opposition that Daniel is facing because of his faithfulness to God. And this is going to lead me to my third point. Not only does God exalt believers because of their faith, not only do believers face opposition because of their faith, but thirdly, believers must fear God more than men because of their faith. Let's pick up reading in verse 10. Now, when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day, and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he did aforetime. Daniel knew the writing had been signed. And what did he do? Well, shucks, I guess I can't go pray anymore. No, that's not what he did. He went up to his house with his windows open, and he got down on his knees, and he did the same thing that he had been before. Why? Because Daniel believed it was more important to follow God rather than following the threats of men. Daniel knew what the consequence was. He read it. He knew the writing was signed and put into law that anyone who disobeyed it was going to be thrown into the den of lions. And he decided to obey anyway, in faith. Verse 11. Then these men assembled, the other presidents and the princes, and they found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. I can almost picture them kind of hiding around Daniel's house, kind of snickering amongst themselves. They see Daniel praying, and they're like, "Aha! We got him! Yes!" And then they go right to Darius, and you can almost see them triumphantly walking into Darius, like, "We got this guy. He's toast." And they go up to Darius, and notice they don't just blurt out that Daniel disobeyed. No, first of all, they entreat Darius, and they remind him, "Oh, King Darius, what was that writing that you signed into law? Didn't you sign something that said for 30 days no one was supposed to worship any other god except you?" And Darius goes, "Yeah, that's true. And it can't be changed because it's the law of the Medes and the Persians." And then in verse 13, then the man answered and said, "That Daniel, which is of the children of the captivity of Judah, regardeth not thee, O king, nor the decree that thou hast signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. You know, your friend Daniel, whom you like so much, whom you trust so much, apparently he doesn't like you so much, because we just saw him praying to his God, even after your writing was signed. Are you seeing how this is all sadistically coming together? Here's Daniel, who decides to obey God in faith. He's first of all exalted by God because of his faith. He faces opposition because of his faith. And thirdly, he decides to do the right thing because of his faith, even though he knew what the consequences would be. Notice Darius' response. He was the king. He could have exploded. He could have been angry at Daniel. But he didn't. He wasn't. Verse 14, Then the king, when he heard these words, was sore displeased with himself. I think this is the point in the story when Darius kind of looked back and he went, oh. So this wasn't really about politics at all. This was about getting Daniel. This was about causing some distrust there because they were jealous of him. And then the rest of the verse goes on to say that Darius labored till the going down of the sun to try to find some legal way to rescue Daniel. But the way their law worked was, it was the law of the Medes and the Persians. Once it was signed into law, it couldn't be changed. The King James has the rendering, it could not be altered. Now, have you ever heard the expression set in stone? That means basically it's set, it's done. Well, in ancient times, they didn't have as much parchment or paper that we have now. So when something was signed into law, it was often etched in a tablet of stone. It was set in stone. Something was signed into law by the king. It's law. It can't be changed. Now, what they could do is they could issue a second decree that basically nullified the first one, but they couldn't go back and change or repeal what had already been signed into law. And that's the plight that we find ourselves in right now, or that Daniel found himself in. Darius tried to legally rescue him, and he couldn't do it. So with remorse, Darius had to command that Daniel be thrown into the den of lions. But notice what Darius says to Daniel, right at the end of verse 16. Now the king spake and said unto Daniel, Thy God, whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee. I tend to think that even though Darius wasn't a believer, it sounds to me like he at least knew Daniel well enough that he knew that Daniel's God was trustworthy. I don't think he had a personal faith in God, but it sounds to me like he at least had something, an inkling of a hope that maybe Daniel's God was the true God. And he said to Daniel, Your God will deliver you. Verse 17, And a stone was brought and laid upon the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet, with the signet of his lords, and that the purpose might not be changed concerning Daniel. At this point in the story, this is an impossible situation. Here's Daniel, who chooses to do the right thing, and as a result, he's thrown into the den of lions. I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound intriguing to me. You know, in ancient times, when people owned lions, when kings owned lions, they starved them on purpose, because that way, when they fed them a prisoner or a slave, the lions would be ravenous. You know, some people think that a way to explain this whole situation is that, well, maybe Daniel wasn't hurt because the lions weren't hungry. We're going to read, just in a couple of verses later, that the lions were very hungry. So that's not the reason. And here's Daniel trapped in this den with ravenous, hungry, ferocious beasts. There's no way out. The door's been closed. It's been sealed by the king. Humanly speaking, there's no way out of this. This is an impossible situation. But God is faithful. And because Daniel was faithful to God, in return we see point number 4. God delivers believers because of their faith. Because Daniel obeyed God, innocency was found in him. Let's keep reading. Verse 18. Then the king went to his palace and passed the night fasting. Neither were instruments of music brought before him, and his sleep went from him. This is kind of ironic, because here's Daniel was just thrown into the lion's den. You would think that Daniel would be the one having a rough night. But that's not how it happened. Daniel was sitting in the lion's den with the Son of God, probably calm as a cucumber. And here's Darius. He can't sleep. He doesn't want any music. He doesn't want to eat. He's worried. It's flipped. The situation is flipped. You would think it'd be the other way around. Then the king arose, verse 19, very early in the morning, and went in haste unto the den of lions. That means he ran. And when he came to the den, he cried with a lamentable voice unto Daniel. And the king spake and said to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God, whom thou servest continually, able to deliver thee from the lions? And as you read verse 21, you can almost hear the sigh of relief from Darius. Then said Daniel unto the king, O king, live forever. My God hath sent his angel, and hath shut the lions' mouths, that they have not hurt me. For as much as before him, before God, innocency was found in me, and also before thee, O king, have I done no hurt. Daniel was found innocent before God because he chose to do the right thing. He chose to obey God over men. Therefore, he was declared innocent. He was also found innocent before the king, because even though he disobeyed, that was an unlawful order. And Daniel was actually more right to disobey the king than to obey. And so he was found righteous before God, and he was found righteous before the king. Next, we see that Daniel's enemies were finally brought to justice. Verse 23, Then was the king exceeding glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no manner of hurt was found upon him, because he believed in his God. And the king commanded, and they brought those men which had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions. And here's where we find out just how hungry they were. Them, their children, and their wives, and the lions had the mastery of them, and brake all their bones in pieces, or ever they came at the bottom of the den. That means before they even hit the bottom of the den, the lions basically killed and destroyed all of those people that were thrown in there. That's the extent of how hungry they were. God does bring justice on those who would cause harm to his followers. Believers will face opposition, but we will be delivered. If not physically, we will be delivered spiritually when we reign with Christ. And those who oppose Christians are going to experience the ultimate judgment of God. And as an example of that, we see that those other princes, they were cast into the den of lions. Now, here's something to consider. Why were their wives and their children also thrown into the den of lions? In American culture, we don't think that's really, I guess we wouldn't really think that's proper. I mean, we don't find the families of murderers and sentence them to prison. No, we find the individual. But my understanding is that in biblical times, when a sin was committed, in order to prevent that thing from ever happening again, they wanted to get rid of it, to get rid of any chance of that particular sin ever happening again. So, to prevent it being passed down generation to generation, they would also get rid of the wife and the family, and even the relatives. This isn't the only example of this, by the way. If you remember the story of Achan sinned at the Battle of Jericho. He took some things that weren't his, and then as a result, Israel lost the first battle of Ai, the only battle in Joshua's campaign that they ever lost. They lost 26 men. And then God pointed out to Joshua that Achan was the one who sinned, and then he said, I want his wife, his kids, his cattle, everything that he owns to be destroyed. Because it was an effort to ensure that this would never happen again. And so I think that's why the president's wives and children were also thrown into the den of lions. This type of treachery was to never happen again. And that's how serious, really, God takes our sin. So, believers will be delivered because of our faith, and those who oppose us will be judged. Those are promises that we can hold on to. Now, notice I'm not arguing for a prosperity gospel. I'm not saying that if we're faithful to God, then life's going to be perfect for us. I mean, here's a guy, Daniel, who was faithful to God, and he was thrown in the den of lions. That doesn't sound like a perfect situation to me. That doesn't sound like a bed of roses. But God was with Daniel the whole time. God never forsook Daniel. And as a result, Daniel was blessed. Daniel was exalted because of his faithfulness. When we're faithful to God, we will experience the blessings of God that are only available to those who believe in Him. And this brings me to my final point. God blesses believers because of their faith. Verse 25. Then King Darius wrote unto all people, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and is steadfast forever, and his kingdom is that which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall be even unto the end. He delivereth and rescueth, and he worketh signs and wonders in heaven and in earth, who hath delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So here Darius issues a second decree. Remember, he can't repeal the first one, but he can issue a second one that nullifies the first one. And here he says, no one in the kingdom is to worship any other God except the God of Daniel, because he is the true God. He is the one who delivers. He is the one who saves. Secondly, we see that Daniel prospered as a result of his faithfulness to God. And he was restored to his position of authority in the kingdom. Now again, I'm not arguing for prosperity gospel. I'm not saying that those who are faithful to God will be president or rich, but we will have favor with God. And that's the point that I'm trying to make. So in conclusion, we must be faithful to God in everything that we do, because faithfulness to God brings blessing on our lives. Blessing doesn't mean prosperity, but rather that God will walk with us through our circumstances. So how does this apply? Well, I started the message with an example of a man who experienced immense persecution, and he was given a choice: either give up the names of your Christian friends so that they could be killed, or suffer to the point of death. I gave you an example of a man in the Bible, Daniel, who was given a choice: either disobey God or be thrown into the den of lions. That meant absolute death. The time is coming in America when I believe we're going to be faced with a similar situation. My question for you is, what are you going to do? How are you going to respond to that? You know, all too often we cower. But guys, the enemy is at work. We're not in a battle, we're in a war. The enemy is working overtime. Homosexuality is running rampant. Too many churches are accepting it. Abortion. Too many believers are shying away from it because they don't want to offend people. Guys, those are lies of the devil. The devil is at work. And persecution is on the rise. And the time's going to come when we stand against those things that I mentioned, and we're going to be called bigots. We're going to be called racist. We already are. But it doesn't end there. I believe there's a time when we're going to give up our freedom because we must stand on what the Word of God says is true. What are you going to do? Are you going to be like Daniel? Are you going to be faithful even though we know what the circumstances might be? Or are we going to cower? But I think there's another way that we can apply this. That's a general application, but there's an individual application. I know that sometimes it's easy to get lost and bogged down in our current situation. I'm a student, so it's easy for me to really forget about the big picture. It's easy for me to forget about the fact that I'm in the training ground. I just focus on the next test or the next project or the next quiz, and that's what is consuming me. When in reality, we're in training for a greater purpose. We're just a small puzzle piece of what God has planned for our life. One day, us students, we're going to graduate, and we're going to join the ministries that God has for us, and we're going to be on the front lines of battle. And it's going to be up to us to stand true no matter what the consequences are. Some of you work full-time jobs. I've been there too. It's easy to just get focused in what you're supposed to do that day. You get up, you eat breakfast, you go to work, you clock in, you do your thing, you clock out, you eat dinner, you go to sleep, you do it again the next day. And it's easy to get bogged down in that. But might I remind you that you are in the place that God has you in right now for a purpose. You are expected to stand true to God's word no matter what you face, even if it means opposition in the workplace, and even if it means to the point of death. So let me encourage you to be like Daniel. Stand true to the word of God, and ultimately you're going to be blessed. You're going to be exalted.